Hello and welcome back. Here we are, our next day of lessons in Chapter 2 for geometry. And we are just going to start off today with a little bit of review. It's good to cycle back through some things just to make sure that we remember definitions and how to write equations and solve things and things like that. So this first slide is just reviewing some things that you already should know. Okay, so if you look at this first question, we have that 2x plus 3 right here, and we have 89 over here. The first question we want to ask ourselves is, what is the angle relationship between those two? Well, if I notice, I have two lines that are crossing, and these two are across from each other, which means they are vertical angles. And one of the things that we need to remember about the definition of vertical angles is that vertical angles are equal to each other. So if we are going to write an equation, we could just say that 2r plus 3 equals 89. And then it's just some basic algebra. I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides, and I get 2r equals 86. If I divide both sides by 2, I get r equals 43. And we can set them equal to each other because they are vertical angles. Okay. And again, we look at this one here. Again, we have two lines that are crossing, and we have a 3x here. We have 2x plus 16 here. And these two are across from each other. They are not adjacent. They are not next to each other. They're across from each other. So that means they are also vertical angles. And that means that we can set them equal to each other. So we can say that 3x equals 2x plus 16. And if I subtract 2x from both sides, I just get x equals 16. Okay. On this next one, if you notice, we have, again, two lines are crossed. But in this case, they are not across from each other, because across from the 15t is right here. So they are not vertical angles, okay? But they are adjacent to each other, so we know that these two angles are adjacent, or right next to each other. They share a common side, and they are also together, they make a straight line. So we would call these a linear pair. Another way that we could talk about a linear pair is to say that they are supplementary, because linear pairs add up to 180 degrees. Anytime two angles together make a straight line, that means we could either call them linear pair or supplementary. It's pretty interchangeable when you do that. But we know that when you add them together, so if we add them together, 20t plus 5 plus 15t makes a straight line, so they are going to equal 180 degrees. And then again, just like we do, we would just combine our like terms to solve. So we have 35t plus 5 equals 180. And then we're going to subtract 5 from both sides to get 175. And 170. So we'd have 35t. After we subtract 5, we get 175. If we divide by 35, we get t equals 5. So we have to look at our diagrams and understand what the picture is showing in order to know how to set up our equations. Okay, so the main idea of this whole rest of this video is the idea of deductive reasoning. So if you notice down here on the bottom, in the last section, we looked at patterns to make conclusion. That was called inductive reasoning, when we just said, oh, it looks like it's counting by 2 every time or anything like that. You just looked for a pattern. What we spend most of our time in this chapter doing is what's called deductive reasoning, which means you have to have facts, you have to have reasons, you have to have properties, and you have to have a logical argument for why you think it's true. So it's not just, oh, I think it's true because it looks like the pattern is that way. With deductive reasoning, you have to have reasons. And we are going to look at just two laws of logic today, okay? The first law of logic is called the law of detachment, okay? And it's really not that difficult. It's if the hypothesis is a true conditional statement, then the conclusion is also true. Okay, so we'll look at what that actually looks like in just a minute. And then the law of syllogism is the other one, where you have to actually put a couple of different conditional statements together in order to make a conclusion. So, okay, let's start with the law of detachment, okay? I call the law of detachment the law of like logical consequences, okay? So the first thing that the law of detachment will do is it will give you a true conditional statement, okay? So the conditional statement is always the first statement. If you cheat on a test and get caught, then you will get a 0 on the test. True statement, okay? The second part is just a statement that says what happened. You cheated on the test, okay? Well, according to our if-then statement in the beginning, if you cheat on a test and get caught, then you will get a 0 on the test. What's the conclusion that we can make? The conclusion is you get a 0 on the test, right? Logical, kind of logical consequences. If you get a 0, or if you cheat, you get a 0. Well, you cheated and got caught, therefore you get a 0. Okay. So looking at just a few examples of this, if you stay out past your curfew, then you will be grounded. Okay. And I'm just going to tell you any of these first conditional statements are going to be true. Okay. If you stay out past your curfew, then you will be grounded. I'm telling you, you stayed out past your curfew. Well, what's the logical consequence to that? You will be grounded. Okay, here we go again. If you earn a 32 on your ACT, you will earn a Regents Scholarship to UNL. Okay, well, you got a 32 on your ACT. What's that mean? What's the logical, in this case, it's not really a consequence, but what's the logical conclusion that you could have? Well, if you got a 32 on your ACT, then you earn a Regents Scholarship. Okay. All right, true statement. If you live in Springfield, Nebraska, I guess we probably should put Nebraska in there. If you live in Springfield, Nebraska, then you live in Sarpy County. Okay. Well, I'm telling you, you live in Springfield, Nebraska. Therefore, you live in Sarpy County. Okay. So it's important to note that sometimes you don't always use the law of detachment correctly. So when you use it correctly, okay, that if part of the conditional statement is then actually what you're stating is true, the conclusion then is going to be your conclusion. So it's basically just taking your conditional statement and breaking it into two parts, okay? If you pass the final exam, then you pass the class. You pass the final exam, you pass the class. It's just taking your conditional statement and breaking it in two. What you cannot do, okay, so you have to be a little bit careful with the law of detachment. So the conditional statement is if you live in this apartment building, in Oak Hills apartment, you cannot have dogs, okay? So you cannot have dogs, all right? Which means our conclusion, using the law of detachment correctly, should be that you cannot have dogs. Which means our statement needs to be if you live in Oak Hills apartment. So the statement that you make is always going to be your hypothesis, of course without the if part of it, and your conclusion is basically going to be your conclusion of your if-then statement. Okay, so you cannot switch these. These cannot be switched. If you wanted to do this correctly, you would say, if you live at Oak Hills apartment, you cannot have a dog. You live at Oak Hills apartment should go first. You cannot have a dog would need to go second. Okay, so now what I want you to do is make up one of your own using the law of detachment. Write a true conditional statement, and then make your statement that's basically your hypothesis, and your conclusion should just be your conclusion. So think of an if-then statement, and then use the law of detachment. And be prepared to share in a little bit when we have a mask break or at sometime when we have a few minutes. Okay? The second law is what's called the law of syllogism, okay? And kind of like I called the law of detachment, the law of logical consequences, I compare the law of syllogism to like the get rid of cable commercials, if you remember those, where like the one that I remember is if you pay too much for cable, then you feel down. If you feel down, then you stay in bed. If you stay in bed, then you give your job to someone new. If you give your job to someone new, then you have a lot to learn. If you have a lot to learn, then mistakes are made. If mistakes are made, then you get body slammed by a lowland gorilla. So the conclusion is if you pay too much for cable, then you get body slammed by a lowland gorilla. If we have some time at the end of the class, there's a whole bunch of there's a whole bunch of those commercials for that basically it's using the law of syllogism. However, the law of syllogism, obviously, if you pay too much for cable, does not necessarily mean that you will get body slammed by a lowland gorilla. But what we want to look at and what we want to notice, this is how the law of syllogism works, okay? So you have an if-then statement. If you pay too much for cable, then you feel down. The second line, the next line is you repeat where you ended. If you feel down, then you stay in bed. Then you repeat. If you stay in bed, then they give your job to someone new. Then you repeat. They give your job to someone new. And it just keeps going on and on. Generally speaking, in geometry, when we use the law of syllogism, we only use 3 rows or 3 lines to make a conclusion. But this is just an example of how you can kind of go on and on with it, and it kind of ends up being a little bit funny. So let's take a look at this law of syllogism, okay? If the sun is shining, then it's a beautiful day. So our hypothesis is if the sun is shining, the conclusion is it is a beautiful day, okay? The law of syllogism then says we're going to write another if-then statement that repeats the conclusion. If it is a beautiful day, then we will have a picnic, okay? Basically, what the law of syllogism does is it cuts out the middleman. So it's going to cut out the green that we have that's repeated. So it cuts out the repeats and goes from beginning to end. And so we end up with if the sun is shining. Oops. Sorry, I need to highlight that. If the sun is shining, then we will have a picnic. So it just skips that part that repeats in the middle, skips the repeat and goes beginning to end. Okay, so let's look again. First statement, if the stereo is on, then the volume is loud. If the volume is loud repeats, the conclusion is, then the neighbors will complain. The law of syllogism takes and gets rid of the middleman, takes out the repeat, and just goes to, if the stereo is on, then the neighbors will complain. Okay, so now you have to actually practice writing them, and then you're going to write your own. So you're going to write a new conditional statement that follows from the pair of true statements. Okay, so let's do exactly that. If you get an A on the math test, then you can go to the movies. If you go to the movies, there's the repeat. You will buy popcorn. Okay, which means our law of syllogism says that we are going to take out the middle repeat, and we're going to go with the if and the then that are left over. So we would have, if you get a on your math test, then you will buy popcorn. Okay, again, exact same thing. We'll just do it one more time. Okay, if you come late to class, you will go to the tardy kiosk. If you go to the tardy kiosk, the teacher emails your parents. Okay, so the conclusion is, again, we just take out the repeat in the middle and we go straight to, if you come late to class, then the teacher emails your parents. Okay, now You wrote an example with the law of detachment on the previous page. Now I want you to do an example using the law of syllogism. And again, be prepared to share. Just keep in mind, they can be funny, but they have to be appropriate and school appropriate too. And then once you're finished with this, you will find in Schoology a homework assignment that's called, let's see here, it's called 2.2 Day 2 Homework. And then I'll probably put something in there that says laws of logic. Okay, and that'll be an attachment in Schoology, so you can go ahead and open it out of Schoology and then submit it through that same assignment. Good luck, have fun.